Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into a really pivotal time in American history, the Progressive Era. That's roughly, what, 1900 to 1920?
That's the usual time frame, yeah. It was a
Yeah.
period of just massive change, lots of reform efforts bubbling up.
And we've got some great historical sources to work with here. So our goal really is to unpack what was driving this whole movement. What were they trying to achieve, and what did they actually manage to get done early on?
Exactly. And it's interesting because it wasn't just one thing. You had different streams feeding into it. There was the legacy of populism,
Right.
which had already raised a lot of these issues.
Right.
Then you had groups like the Mugwumps, kind of the established folks worried about the changes, and also this new growing middle class.
Yeah.
And the common thread, the sort of core belief, was that government could be a force for good, that an efficient government could step in, protect the public, and, restore some sense of order to all the chaos of industrialization.
Okay, so let's trace those roots. You mentioned populism and the Greenback Labor Party before them. It's interesting how they started out focused more on rural issues, right?
Yeah.
Taking on the big railroad guys, the robber barons.
Absolutely. That focus on the robber barons, those powerful industrialists making fortunes, often, not very nicely, that was key. The populist push for railroad regulation was huge.
That's right.
It was this early recognition that, hey, unchecked private power can actually hurt everyone. That became a core progressive idea later.
So what kinds of things were they proposing back then?
Oh, a whole list. They
Yeah.
wanted financial reforms, like an income tax, which, boom, becomes the 16th Amendment later,
Wow.
and more currency, easier credit things that led towards the Federal Reserve System eventually. Plus, big democratic changes, direct election of senators, the 17th Amendment,
Right.
and giving people more power through things like the initiative, referendum, recall, even stuff like postal savings banks and the sub-treasury plan. These ideas popped up again with the progressives.
So these weren't just fringe ideas that faded away. They actually stuck around and got implemented.
They really did. And like you said, they might have started rural, but urban progressives saw the value. They thought, okay, we can use these tools, government action, more democracy to tackle our problems, the trusts, the corrupt city bosses, the terrible social conditions.
That makes sense. So it's a bridge from rural discontent to urban reform.
hmm
Now, besides the populist legacy, you mentioned the Mugwumps. What was their deal? Who were they?
The Mugwumps, they were often sort of upper middle class, established types. Think old money families, professionals. They felt like the America they knew was slipping away because of these new super rich industrialists.
Right.
They worried about monopolies taking over, about government becoming a plutocracy run by the wealthy or an oligarchy run by just a few powerful people. Their traditional values, Protestant ethics, Victorian ideals about merit and civic duty, seemed totally threatened by all the money and corruption.
And they felt squeezed out politically.
Yeah, they hated the big city political machines, felt they were just tools for business interests. Remember, they bolted from the Republican Party in 1884 to back Grover Cleveland, a Democrat. That shows how strongly they felt.
Okay. And then the emerging middle class, they kind of felt similarly.
In many ways, yes, they shared that unease, that desire for like a level playing field, equality of opportunity, and often that same drive for moral reform. But this middle class was pretty diverse.
How so?
Well, you had people pushing specifically for political reforms. You had intellectuals studying society's problems. Women were becoming much more active in public life.
Right.
Journalists starting to investigate things. People involved in the social gospel movement pushing for justice. Plus, lots of professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers.
What united them then?
A feeling of being kind of overlooked. They weren't the super rich industrialists, but they also weren't necessarily the recent immigrants who the political machines sometimes catered to, often corruptly, but still.
Mhm.
And you got to remember the scale of immigration. By 1900, almost 1 out of every 7 people in the U.S. was foreign-born. Huge demographic shifts happening.
Wow, 1 in 7. Okay, so you've got all these different groups converging, feeling uneasy or underrepresented. What were the big concrete problems they decided to tackle? What was top of the progressive agenda?
Definitely the trusts. These giant corporations consolidating power, squeezing out competition. It felt fundamentally unfair.
And the wealth gap was getting pretty visible.
Oh, yeah. By 1910, the richest 2% held nearly 20% of the income. That kind of inequality, plus the showiness of the nouveau riche, it really bred resentment. People saw these oligopolies forming, crushing smaller businesses, and then using that economic power to influence politics. That's the plutocracy worry, again, government basically controlled by big money.
Right. And tied into that, you had the political machines. How exactly did they work and why were they such a target?
These were the city, sometimes state-level political organizations run by bosses. They stayed in power through, well, corruption mostly, taking bribes, doing favors for businesses that paid them off.
All at taxpayer expense, presumably.
Exactly. And they built loyalty among immigrant groups by providing services or jobs in exchange for votes. Now, that gave immigrants some connection to power, but it also meant the system often ignored everyone else and wasn't really about good government. Tammany Hall in New York is the poster child for this kind of corrupt machine politics.
Okay. Trusts, political machines.
Yeah.
And then the third big area was just the awful conditions in the cities, right? The shame of the cities, as it was called.
Absolutely appalling conditions. You had massive urbanization happening incredibly fast. Between 1880 and 1920, something like 27 million immigrants came, mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe.
27 million.
Yeah, huge numbers. Plus, Americans were leaving farms for cities too, looking for jobs, excitement, maybe the anonymity, new stuff like electricity.
But the cities just couldn't handle it.
Not even close. Housing was jammed. These dumbbell tenements were notorious fire traps with terrible sanitation, infrastructure, sewers, water, police couldn't keep up. So you had rampant crime, violence, gambling, prostitution, and work conditions. Just brutal.
Especially for women and children, I gather.
Definitely. Exploitation was widespread. The accident rates in factories were horrific. Think about this. Estimates suggest 500,000 workers were injured and maybe 30,000 killed each year in industrial accidents around this time.
30,000 deaths a year. That's staggering.
It really is. And interestingly, the main labor union, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, they were actually kind of hesitant about pushing for government labor laws, except maybe for child labor. They worried the laws could be turned against unions, preferring to rely on collective bargaining power.
Huh. Okay, so that paints a pretty bleak picture of the problems. But it wasn't just about seeing the problems, right? There was an intellectual shift happening too, these progressive analysts.
Yes, this is really important. There was a sea change in how people thought about solving problems. College enrollment quadrupled between 1870 and 1920.
Quadrupled. Wow.
Yeah. And universities started creating social science departments, economics, political science, sociology. The idea was to apply scientific objective methods to understand society, figure out what was wrong, and how to fix it. There was this growing belief, this optimism that humans could understand and solve social problems, moving away from that harsh survival of the fittest idea that had been dominant.
So less acceptance of that's just the way things are.
Exactly. More faith in human agency. And many of these academics and their students got directly involved in reform movements.
Were there any key thinkers driving this shift?
Definitely. John Dewey in education was huge. He pushed for learning by doing, making education relevant to life, creating good citizens. You see the results. High school graduation rates almost doubled by the 1920s. Then there was Lester Frank Ward. He directly attacked survival of the fittest, arguing that humans, with our intelligence, can actually control and improve our environment. He thought government had a positive role to play, like tackling bad housing.
So government as a tool for improvement.
Precisely. And you had others like Richard Ely, big in the social gospel movement, Charles Beard, looking at city government reform. Even Woodrow Wilson started as a political scientist.
And did scientific progress in other areas feed into this optimism?
It seems like it did. Look at the Rockefeller Foundation's work in the South. They practically wiped out hookworm through a public health campaign. That's a concrete example of science improving lives on a massive scale. And life expectancy was going up too, thanks to better health knowledge and practices.
Okay. Now, before this progressive wave really crested, there were already people sounding the alarm, right?
Yeah.
Critics who kind of paved the way for the muckrakers.
Absolutely. These early voices were critical. You had Henry Damaris Lloyd. His book Wealth Against Commonwealth in 1894 was this deep dive into Standard Oil's practices, really one of the first big pieces of investigative journalism.
Right.
Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class skewered the wasteful spending of the super rich. Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, used photos and writing to expose the horrors of New York slums. It really affected Theodore Roosevelt, actually.
I'd heard that.
And Charlotte Perkins Gilman, with Woman in Economics, was making radical arguments for women's economic independence, suggesting things like communal kitchens and nurseries.
Way ahead of her time.
Totally. And don't forget the socialists. Many were immigrants bringing critiques of capitalism from Europe. They offered a more fundamental challenge, though some progressives like Wilson saw them as kind of a threat. And the social gospel folks, Walter Rauschenbusch, Washington Gladden, were pushing churches to focus on fixing problems here on earth, not just the afterlife.
Okay, so all this groundwork is laid. Then come the muckrakers. What was their specific role? How did they amplify things?
The muckrakers were the journalists who really blew the lid off things for a mass audience. They used these new popular magazines, McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, everybody's, to publish in-depth exposés of corruption and social ills.
And they were careful about their facts.
Generally, yes. They had to be because the people they were writing about were powerful and could sue. It took courage and resources. Even the more sensationalist yellow press papers like Pulitzer's and Hearst's played a part in just getting these stories out there.
Can you give some examples? Who were the big names and what did they expose?
Sure. Lincoln Steffens wrote The Shame of the Cities, detailing the dodgy alliances between businesses and city governments. Ida Tarbell did this incredibly thorough takedown of Standard Oil and Rockefeller. Her work is often credited with helping lead to its breakup later. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, that's the famous one about the Chicago meatpacking plants. The public reaction was so strong, it directly led to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906.
Yeah, that book had a huge impact.
Huge. Then David G. Phillips wrote The Treason of the Senate, arguing senators were basically working for the trusts, not the people. That series actually prompted Teddy Roosevelt to coin the term muckraker, maybe not entirely flatteringly.
Oh, okay.
And you had others. John Spargo on child labor, The Bitter Cry of the Children, Ray Stannard Baker on racism and the conditions for Black Americans following the color line. Frank Norris wrote novels like The Octopus about railroad corruption affecting farmers. Even novelists like Theodore Dreiser were exploring these themes of finance and power.
So the muckrakers light the fire, get people talking. But someone had to translate that into action, right? The activists.
Exactly. Public outrage is one thing, organizing for change is another. And this was a time when women were increasingly moving into cities, into the workforce, over 1 million in the 1890s alone, but often into terrible conditions. So women were really central to the activist side.
Who stands out there?
Jane Addams is just iconic. Hull House in Chicago, the settlement house she co-founded, it became this incredible hub for women's activism and social reform. Not just charity, but research, advocacy, organizing. She's also involved in founding the NAACP and was a strong pacifist.
Okay.
And Florence Kelley, who actually lived at Hull House for a while, she spent her life fighting against child labor and advocating for workers, consumers, Black Americans. She led the National Consumers League, organizing boycotts to pressure companies for better conditions. Interesting fact. She was a socialist.
So they were really pushing for concrete changes. What were some of the early wins, especially around women and child labor?
They did get some important victories. There was a Supreme Court case, Mueller v. Oregon in 1906, that upheld a 10-hour workday law for women. Now, the legal reasoning used then about women's physical frailty seems really sexist today.
Right.
But at the time, it was seen as a win for limiting working hours. Many states also passed safety codes, sanitation rules, and restrictions on kids working in dangerous jobs.
Did any specific event galvanize action?
Tragically, yes. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City in 1911. Over 140 workers, mostly young immigrant women, died because doors were locked and fire escapes were inadequate. It was horrific.
Oh, I remember reading about that. Awful.
It shocked the nation and led directly to much stronger laws about factory safety and sweatshop conditions, first in New York, then elsewhere. By 1916, most states had some laws regulating child labor hours and ages, and some were bringing in compulsory education too. But it's worth remembering, the courts, especially the Supreme Court, would later strike down some of these labor protections. Progress wasn't always linear.
Okay, so social reforms are happening. But the progressives also knew they needed to fix the political system itself, right? What happened at the state level?
Yes, the states became real laboratories for democracy, for trying out reforms. Wisconsin, under Governor Robert La Follette, is the classic example. The Wisconsin experiment, or Wisconsin idea.
What did La Follette do?
He went head-to-head with the political bosses and the big lumber and railroad companies that dominated the state. He brought in experts from the University of Wisconsin to help craft policy like Richard Ely again.
All right.
Yeah. He pushed for things like regulating public utilities, creating worker safety laws, replacing the old spoil system with a professional civil service based on merit. Big stuff.
And more direct democracy.
Absolutely. Wisconsin adopted the direct primary in 1903, so voters, not party bosses, chose the candidates. They brought in the initiative, referendum, and recall tools for citizens to propose laws, vote on laws, and remove officials. Wisconsin was also first to adopt a state income tax and pushed early for direct election of senators, paving the way for the 17th Amendment.
So Wisconsin was really out front. Were other states doing similar things?
Oh, yeah. It wasn't just Wisconsin. In California, Hiram Johnson took on the powerful Southern Pacific Railroad. In New York, Charles Evans Hughes made a name investigating corruption in big industries. And Woodrow Wilson, as governor of New Jersey, implemented a wave of liberal reforms before he became president.
Any other specific reforms spreading across states?
The Australian ballot, the secret ballot, became widespread. That helped reduce outright vote buying.
Made sense.
But it had a downside. It made voting harder for people who couldn't read, which disproportionately hurt black voters in the South and some poor whites, too. Another idea was the commission system of city government. It started in Galveston, Texas, after a hurricane, basically replacing the mayor and council with a small group of expert commissioners. Lots of cities adopted it, hoping it would be more efficient and less corrupt than the old machine politics.
But maybe less democratic.
That was the concern, yeah. Efficiency versus broad participation, and maybe the working class lost some influence.
Okay, so lots happening at the state level. But then Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. And that really brings progressivism to the national stage, doesn't it? He's seen as the first modern president.
Definitely. TR knew how to use the presidency as a bully pulpit, as he called it, to shape public opinion and push his agenda. He was a huge supporter of progressive ideas, even if his actual policies were sometimes more moderate than his speeches.
And he wasn't afraid to act, even without Congress.
Not at all. He bypassed Congress when he felt he needed to, and he was incredibly popular with much of the public. He also dramatically increased America's role in the world, that whole speak softly and carry a big stick idea. He believed in military strength.
Domestically, his program was the Square Deal, right? What did that involve?
Yeah, the Square Deal was his slogan. He said it aimed for fairness between capital, labor, and the public. It boiled down to three main goals, the three C's: control of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources.
Okay, let's break those down. Control of corporations, what did that look like under TR?
The anthracite coal strike in 1902 was a huge moment. Miners went on strike, threatened a winter coal shortage. Roosevelt did something no president had done before he intervened directly, even threatened to send the army to seize the mines.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it forced the owners to accept arbitration, and the miners got some, though not all, of their demands. It showed the federal government could step in on the side of labor, potentially. He also created the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903 with a Bureau of Corporations specifically to investigate big business.
The trustbuster reputation comes from this period.
Mostly from the Northern Securities case. He went after J.P. Morgan's massive railroad trust, and in 1904 the Supreme Court ordered it broken up. That cemented his image as a trustbuster. He did go after others' beef, sugar, oil trusts. And he pushed for laws like the Elkins Act to stop railroad rebates and the Hepburn Act to give the Interstate Commerce Commission real power to set railroad rates.
But it wasn't against all trust.
No, that's key. He made a distinction between good trusts, efficient, not abusing power, and bad trusts, acting like monopolies, hurting the public. He believed more in regulating trusts than just breaking them all up. Interestingly, trusts actually grew bigger during his presidency, and his successor, Taft, busted more trusts than he did. TR even okayed a big merger involving U.S. Steel during the Panic of 1907.
Okay. So regulation more than demolition. What of the second C? Consumer protection.
This really took off because of concerns about food safety, partly driven by European countries threatening to ban American meat, and then boom, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle hits in 1906.
We mentioned that one, the meatpacking expose.
Exactly. The public reaction was visceral. People were disgusted. Roosevelt himself was apparently really affected by it. That public pressure led directly to Congress passing the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, setting up federal inspection. And the Pure Food and Drug Act passed the same year, tackling adulterated foods and bogus patent medicines.
So direct results from that muckraking journalism.
Absolutely. A clear link.
And the third C, conservation. This was a big personal cause for it, wasn't it?
Huge. Probably his most lasting legacy. He was an outdoorsman, deeply interested in nature. He worked closely with Gifford Pinchot, head of the Forest Service. Their approach was more about wise use, managing resources sustainably rather than just locking everything up.
What were the key actions?
The Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902 was important. It used money from selling public lands to fund irrigation projects out west, building dams, canals. And he massively expanded the national forests, setting aside about 125 million acres as federal reserves. That was way more than all previous presidents combined. He also protected millions of acres of coal lands and water power sites.
So a pretty active presidency.
Yeah.
But he decided not to run for a third term in 1908, right? Became a lame duck.
Yeah, he stuck to the two-term tradition then. His last couple of years were marked by the Panic of 1907, a big financial crisis on Wall Street. Banks failed, there was turmoil.
How did Roosevelt handle that?
He actually worked with J.P. Morgan, the big financier, to stabilize things, prevent a total collapse. It was controversial business types blamed TR's policies for the panic, while TR blamed Wall Street greed.
Did the panic change anything?
It definitely highlighted problems with the banking system, the need for a more elastic money supply. That helped pave the way for the Federal Reserve Act a few years later, and it might have made more middle-class people open to reform ideas, seeing how unstable things could be.
Okay, so Roosevelt steps down, and his chosen successor, William Howard Taft, wins in 1908. How did Taft compare?
Very different style. Taft wasn't the dynamic, charismatic leader TR was. He was more cautious, more legalistic, preferred the status quo. He ended up aligning more with the conservative old guard Republicans than the progressives.
But he still pursued some progressive policies. You mentioned he busted more trusts.
He did. His administration brought more antitrust suits than Roosevelt's, including the final breakup of Standard Oil and American Tobacco. But they also introduced this rule of reason idea from the Supreme Court, which said only unreasonable restraints of trade were illegal. That made future trust busting harder.
What else happened under Taft?
He continued conservation efforts, created the Bureau of Mines, protected water power sites. The Mann-Elkins Act extended regulation to telephones and telegraphs. And he signed the postal savings bank system into law that was an old populist idea finally becoming reality.
So not entirely anti-progressive, but his presidency is remembered for the Republican Party splitting apart. What caused that?
It was a perfect storm, really. The biggest single issue was probably the Payne-Aldrich tariff in 1909. Progressives wanted lower tariffs, Taft promised it, but the final bill ended up keeping rates high, even raising some. Taft signed it anyway, and the progressive wing of the party was furious, felt betrayed.
Okay, that's one major blow. What else?
The Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Ballinger, opened up some protected lands in Alaska for development. Gifford Pinchot, TR's conservation buddy, still heading the Forest Service, protested publicly. Taft fired Pinchot.
Ouch. That couldn't have gone over well with Roosevelt's allies.
Not at all. It looked like Taft was abandoning TR's conservation legacy, even though Taft actually did protect a lot of land. It became a huge controversy and drove a wedge between Taft and the Roosevelt loyalists. Taft also sided with the conservative leadership in Congress against progressive Republicans trying to reduce the power of the Speaker of the House, Uncle Joe Cannon.
So Taft is aligning with the conservatives, alienating the progressives.
Exactly. And then in 1910, Roosevelt comes back from Africa and jumps back into politics with this fiery speech in Osawatomie, Kansas. He lays out his new nationalism doctrine.
New nationalism, what was it?
It was a call for a much more powerful federal government to actively regulate the economy and promote social welfare. Think strong regulation of business, tariff reform, income tax, labor reforms, campaign finance rules, even direct democracy tools like initiative and referendum. It was a full-throated progressive platform way beyond what Taft was comfortable with.
So Roosevelt is challenging Taft's leadership, basically.
Pretty directly, yeah. The Republicans got hammered in the 1910 midterm elections. And then the final straw for Roosevelt. In 1911, Taft's administration filed an antitrust suit against U.S. Steel, targeting that merger TR had allowed back in '07. Roosevelt saw it as a personal attack.
Okay, so the split seems inevitable by then.
Totally. Early 1911, progressive Republicans formed their own league. Initially, Robert La Follette looked like their candidate for 1912, but then Roosevelt himself decided to challenge Taft for the nomination. When the Republican convention, dominated by the old guard, gave the nomination to Taft, Roosevelt supporters walked out and formed their own party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party.
The Bull Moose Party. Okay, so that sets up the wild election of 1912. Who were the players and what were they offering?
You had three main contenders. Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, ran on his New Freedom platform. He emphasized breaking up trusts, antitrust action was key, plus monetary reform and lower tariffs. Wilson talked about restoring competition, favoring small businesses, maybe a slightly more limited federal role in social issues compared to Roosevelt. He was influenced by Louis Brandeis on the antitrust stuff.
Dick Wilson and New Freedom. Then Roosevelt.
Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party running on new nationalism. He argued that big trusts and big unions were probably here to stay, so the answer wasn't just breaking them up, but strong federal regulation to make them serve the public good. His platform was pure progressivism. Women's suffrage, income tax, lower tariffs, campaign finance limits, currency reform, all sorts of social welfare programs like minimum wage and social insurance. It was ambitious. Remember, he even got shot during the campaign and still gave his speech.
Incredible. And Taft.
Taft was the official Republican nominee, backed by the conservative wing. He didn't campaign very actively. He represented the status quo, more or less.
So 3 distinct choices. What happened?
Wilson won. He got about 41% of the popular vote, which was enough because Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote. Roosevelt actually came in second, Taft a distant third.
So the split decided it.
Absolutely. If the Republicans had united behind one candidate, they likely would have won. The combined Roosevelt and Taft vote was much larger than Wilson's. But the split gave Wilson the presidency and the Democrats control of Congress. It really showed how strong progressive sentiment was overall, though.
Was there anyone else significant in that election?
Yes. Eugene V. Debs, running as a socialist, got almost 1 million votes, about 6% of the total. That was the high watermark for the Socialist Party in America. Their platform called for government ownership of railroads and utilities, lots of social welfare stuff. They drew support from more radical unions like the IWW, the Wobblies. Their radicalism probably limited their appeal, but they were definitely part of the conversation.
So Wilson wins. But the progressive impulse seems really strong across the board. Did the Bull Moose Party last?
Not really. It was mostly built around Roosevelt's personality. It didn't build a strong grassroots organization in most places. But its impact was huge because it pushed Wilson and the Democrats to adopt more progressive policies than they might have otherwise.
Okay, so wrapping up this part of the story, this early progressive era, what are the big takeaways from the sources we looked at? The achievements, maybe the limits?
Well, it's clear they achieved quite a bit. You see real efforts to grapple with corporate power, to clean up politics, to address those terrible social conditions. Laws were passed, regulations were put in place, the role of government definitely started to change.
But it wasn't perfect.
No, definitely not. Reforms faced opposition, they got watered down, courts struck some down. Sometimes they had unintended consequences, like the secret ballot disenfranchising some voters. It shows how hard big societal change really is.
So a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Thinking about this era,
Yeah, maybe think about this. How much did this period really change the fundamental relationship between the American government and its people? And looking at the problems they faced, corporate power, inequality, political corruption, social justice, how do those issues and the ways the progressives tried to tackle them resonate with the challenges we're still dealing with today?
that's a great question. It definitely feels like a period with echoes in our own time. There's so much more to explore here, the individuals, the laws, the movements. Definitely worth digging deeper.